Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Research. I'm very pleased that she has traveled down from Bombay to be with us. She's an emeritus professor and is widely published in international finance and governance, and has received national and international awards, edits a Routledge journal, and is active in the domestic policy debate, served on several boards and policy committees, including the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council, and she's a member of the RBI's Monetary Policy Committee and chair of a task force on repurposing the international financial architecture in T20. She's received various national and international awards and was selected as one of the most powerful women in Indian business by Business Today in 2021 and 22. Ashima, thank you. This is somewhat different in its rhythm from the other sessions, but because it's virtual, I hope it works just as well. We would call the two speakers are not linked by themes, but I think what they have to say in succession will illuminate some of the things that have come up during the day that they've not been able to share. And then following their interventions and a discussion around that, I will call on Kapil Kapoor, Regional Director for Asia at IDRC, to provide a summary of the first day before we move on for... okay. Well, I don't know. Are you... how long would your summary be, Kapil? Okay, because they've... okay, does that work for you? People have already been waiting for a while. The idea was, would you like to go immediately, or would you like to hear a summary of the day? Your call. I think, Robert, you're first. I don't know what time pressure.
It's very helpful for me to hear what has been said.
Okay, is that good with you, Homi? Do you have time for that, Homi? Okay, good. Over to you, Kapil.
So I just wanted to thank you for setting up this session and this conference, for inviting us. And it's been a really tough day, a long day, but very interesting. And I think we have some fresh blood, as they say, coming in this session. So we look forward to hearing the speakers who are joining us from outside. And we thought that it would be very helpful if Kapil just gives a brief summary of the day's proceedings, which will help the outside speakers to cue in. So, Kapil, please.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Let me first say that we've had an incredibly rich set of discussions today, and trying to summarize it in 10 minutes is going to be a challenge. We've had a team from IDRC and GDN that have helped me to put this together. And I understand that some use of artificial intelligence was also made because they used ChatGPT to try and structure the summary. So if it doesn't work, let's blame ChatGPT and artificial intelligence, and not me. So we started the session, the first session today, which focused on energy, climate, and growth. And the session began by asking the question, how do we move towards a green development pact and ensure a just transition to mitigate the impact of climate change? A transition that takes into account livelihoods and the human impact of transitioning to net zero emissions, while ensuring that the shift to net zero is net positive. It was pointed out that the benefits of addressing climate change are distributed globally, but the costs are localized, and therefore international collaboration is critically important. A tough political challenge is that there are short-term upfront costs of mitigation, while the benefits only materialize over the longer term. And so this presents a political challenge. Strategies such as carbon pricing, smart infrastructure, and the flexible elements of the Paris Agreement can help manage these challenges. Speakers indicated that as a significant global emitter reliant on fossil fuels, while India is facing a challenging transition, renewable energy sources are gaining ground. The transition presents substantial potential for job creation, particularly through distributed energy and new economic activities. It was pointed out that climate emergencies exacerbate fiscal challenges and result in several trade-offs: energy access versus clean energy security versus energy sustainability, and job growth versus job losses during the transition. Given the high climate variability and vulnerability of regions like India, there is a need to view adaptation as an economic issue. This includes incentivizing transitions in individual choice, procurement, infrastructure programs, and innovation. A couple of the speakers highlighted the importance of multilateralism. Climate change requires multilateral solutions, including creating resilience funds, de-risking, promoting circular economies, joint technological development, and enhancing green security and transition partnerships. The importance of flexibility, especially for countries in the global south, was highlighted. Flexibility in terms of switching sectors, switching inputs, and changing locations. Such flexibility will provide countries with the means to adapt and innovate in response to environmental shifts. We then moved on to the second session, which focused on technology, policy, and jobs. Presenters pointed out that the emergence of new economic models and national security concerns are impacting the ongoing technological revolution, particularly AI advancements. Demographic and economic shifts are contributing to the rise of a multipolar world. Global growth is impacting the environment, raising the likelihood of unforeseen disruptive events. Presenters highlighted a series of challenges. Technological progress and AI are reshaping the job landscape and raising concerns about job displacement. The aging global population presents a significant challenge to maintaining economic growth. Migration, triggered by environmental pressures, could also shift future carbon emission patterns. The rapid pace of AI progression is creating numerous policy challenges, including regulatory issues, AI's carbon footprint, ethical considerations, security risks, and potential job losses. As a way forward, presenters made the following suggestions. It is crucial to invest in education and stimulate labor force participation through measures such as extending the retirement age. Sustainability should be viewed broadly to encompass human well-being rather than strict economic activity. There is a need to strengthen and restructure international cooperation to tackle shared challenges like skill development, job creation, and productivity. Generative AI requires a comprehensive regulatory framework, ethical guidelines, and proactive industry self-governance. Investing in technological infrastructure, enhancing digital education, and boosting public-private partnerships are essential for an inclusive and sustainable transition. Adopting progressive labor practices and leveraging emerging technologies, particularly in developing markets, can be transformative. Industry investment in R&D, training, and multidisciplinary research are also key to navigating future challenges. We then had this very interesting session just before lunch, where Nandan Nilekani made a presentation, where he pointed out that in an era of global demographic shifts, warming climates, and geopolitical changes, technology is enabling the reformation of economies. India's diversity in terms of cultures, markets, industrialization levels, and regulations have posed a significant challenge to economic formalization. Informality and the lack of technological advancement in public service delivery rendered the economy vulnerable to inefficiencies. The impact of climate change further necessitated the need for mechanisms that could expedite both mitigation and adaptation efforts. In India, digital public infrastructure, or DPI, has facilitated a transition from a predominantly offline, informal, and low productivity landscape to a unified, formal economy underpinned by DPI infrastructure. DPI has been pivotal in transforming India's economic landscape and has enabled multiple public and private solutions. It has accelerated financial inclusion, boosted public finances, reduced pilferage in welfare spending, and provided a fillip to the entrepreneurial ecosystem. DPI, like the Open Network for Digital Commerce, has democratized the digital economy and fostered competitive and equitable market dynamics. By embedding policy into source codes, DPI is also reconciling the demand for innovation with regulatory necessities. Through a series of such multi-pronged interventions, DPI is shaping the contours of a more resilient, equitable, and sustainable economy. For India's experience to be replicated in other countries, what is needed is political will, deep conviction, and not deep pockets. Also, the availability of technical talent is an asset. We then moved on to the third session, which focused on growth implications of a fractured trading system. Speakers talked about the age of hyperglobalization. Technological innovation and advances in transportation led to the fragmentation of manufacturing processes, reduction in trade barriers, and the incorporation of 1 billion lower wage workers into the global labor force. This era was marked by a rise in global GDP and trade. But then there was the shift to globalization. A noticeable shift has occurred, which has been characterized by increased restrictions on trade, labor movements, and limited technology diffusion. This transition indicates a significant transformation in the global economy. Despite the global slowdown, China has maintained its position as a key driver of global growth. China's resilience is largely attributed to its focus on exporting more value-added products, particularly in clean tech. Europe has suffered significant losses due to deglobalization. Concurrently, US-China decoupling has led to increased trade and financial protectionism. The world's increasing dependence on China, particularly in clean and green tech sectors, suggests potential risks for global supply chains. In terms of the way forward, speakers pointed out that with China facing an aging population, India could step up as the next global growth engine. However, it must address its deindustrialization and boost its manufacturing sector. Strategies for sustained growth should include enhancing productivity in traditional sectors, creating manufacturing jobs, managing competitive exchange rates, closing infrastructure and logistic gaps, and improving education and skills development. To facilitate this transition and maintain the growth momentum, reforms of multilateral trade rules are needed, including retrieving policy space for industrialization and the transfer of technology. This then took us to the last session, session 4, which was on reshaping global finance for sustainable growth. The current global financial architecture, marred by dysfunction and cluttered with non-economic issues, requires significant restructuring. The financial shortfall, estimated at about $3 trillion annually over the next decade, highlights an urgent need for both public and private resource mobilization. Additionally, the fragmented nature of this architecture is contributing to disparities in economic recovery between developed and developing regions. These challenges call for an orderly transition to more affordable and sustainable systems. Increasing global financing needs in the face of dwindling liquidity present a substantial challenge, particularly for developing nations. 3 types of financing: private sector, multilateral, and bilateral, each come with their own complications, from volatility to limited availability. Emerging economies are further threatened by capital volatility and exchange rate risks, as their financial integration deepens. The global debt architecture, currently informal, inefficient, and fragmented, poses additional challenges, with many low-income countries already in or nearing debt crises. Moreover, the world is behind schedule in transitioning to net zero emissions, exacerbating the climate crisis and necessitating significant upfront pricing, primarily from private sources. Take me just about 30 seconds more. So in terms of the way forward, the following priorities were identified. Reforming financial systems and processes is key to overcoming these challenges. This includes making SDR allocations rule-based and less discretionary, as well as improving the multilateral systems. Debt needs to be managed sustainably and transparently, possibly by establishing a multilateral creditor club and strengthening legal frameworks. Financial safety nets need strengthening, bilateral swap lines expanded, and IMF contingency lines invoked to make capital flows safer. The role of credit rating agencies should also be regulated to ensure fair assessment for emerging countries. Lastly, scaling up green financing, especially for regions like Africa, will require innovative policies and tools to drive the global transition to net zero. This includes fostering green investors, enabling policies, and encouraging international cooperation.
Bravo.
Wonderful, excellent timing. I must say ChatGPT is a very good assistant.
I take the credit now.
The only problem is I think ChatGPT, major sort of lacuna is it doesn't make jokes. So, Kapil Kapoor, as Regional Director, Asia IDRC, is one of our hosts and was introduced to us in the morning. And he's made a yearling contribution now in keeping us informed. So now Professor Robert Lawrence is going to talk to us, and he is the professor at Harvard University, also a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute of International Economics and a research associate at the NBER. He has actually been advisor to President Clinton, and he's also a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, received his PhD from Yale. But most important, he has a huge amount of research articles and books in the area of trade, technology, policy, and these are all topics we've been discussing through the day. So we look forward to his comments. Thank you, Professor.
I'm having some trouble just sharing my screen. Please bear with me. Yeah, maybe if the management could put my slides up, it would help.
Do you have this?
Well, let me then not use slides. I will just. Can they do it?
They have it. Are you trying?
Okay, I'll start talking anyway, in order not to waste time. The mandate, firstly, it's an absolute pleasure for me to be here, and it is humbling to listen to the brilliance of ChatGPT, which obviously reflects the quality of the audience. And in effect, they have touched on many of the themes that I was going to talk about. I wanted to very briefly, my topic is technology, policy, and jobs. And so I'd like to talk about the employment dimension of technological changes that we've experienced in the past, that we're likely to see continue in the future, and then to reflect on some policy responses to those, particularly with an emphasis on what they mean for the labor market. We have undergone a major transformation in our economies, and I would say since the 1980s, there are three huge shocks which have hit the economy. The first, I would characterize as skill-biased structural change. Basically, because of relatively rapid productivity growth in manufacturing, what has happened is that the share of employment in manufacturing has declined in many countries, and this phenomenon, could you do the next slide, please? So this phenomenon of skill-biased technical change has led to much more difficulty in developing countries achieving the same levels of manufacturing employment shares as today's advanced economies were able to achieve. And this has meant fewer employment opportunities. Manufacturing was a major ladder to inclusion and to allowing workers to join the middle class, and those opportunities have diminished. This is not to say that manufacturing can no longer play a role, especially in countries like India. We've also seen within industries a skill-biased technical change. Digital technologies have tended to complement the skills of more educated workers and to substitute for the skills, especially of mid-level workers. This has resulted in a polarization of the labor market with fewer opportunities, again, for those workers with mid-level skills. And then a third dimension, which I don't think is sufficiently appreciated, is that the nature of capital has changed. And it is increasingly intangible, so that inputs such as software, databases, patents, algorithms, organizational capital, and branding have become much more important. If you look at the US data, what you see is that these forms of fixed assets today are more important than equipment. A lot of people talk about automation, but in fact, it's, if you will, intellectualization, which is driving capital formation. Next slide, please. As we look to the future, there are challenges, especially for less skilled workers and for countries that specialize in labor-intensive products. Of course, we're seeing investments in robotics, in 3D printing and augmented manufacturing, and now we get AI, whose impact ultimately is uncertain, but certainly the capacity to substitute for routine workers is going to be considerable. So these are pressures which now face all countries, but especially those who seek to specialize in unskill-intensive manufacturing products. Next slide. But in fact, there are also considerable opportunities which new technologies are going to provide. We have this capacity, unbelievable capacity for people throughout the world to access knowledge. We have the ability to, what Gershon used to call the advantages of relative backwardness, to use the technologies to save on bricks and mortars. So AI could actually work in both ways. And as was noted in the general discussion you had, e-commerce gives us new opportunities for entrepreneurs. We have the ability to do remote work, not only within countries, but across borders. Richard Baldwin calls this globalization. And in fact, there's this mechanism whereby if those who live in developing countries are able to literally be employed in advanced countries, earn higher wages, and then spend their money on non-traded goods, this can provide opportunities for less skilled workers. So there are mechanisms we can see that could improve future opportunities. Next slide. Now, what has been striking is that, and the reason I felt it necessary to sort of recap some of these trends is that as I look at the new policies that are being implemented, I think they, by and large, are going to reinforce these skill-biased technical changes. We see the emergence of technological rivalries in which countries are vying for global leadership, and they're doing so in the kinds of technologies which tend to work against less skilled workers. So I've already mentioned some, robotics, additive manufacturing, 3D printing, but as you go further and you look at semiconductors, nanotechnology, advanced materials, autonomous vehicles, telecommunication technologies, advanced pharmaceuticals, well, just naming them makes you immediately picture the kind of skilled and educated workers that are going to be required in order to advance these technologies. So the rivalries that the geopolitics are causing, I think, are going to play into these forceful trends which are tending to work against less skilled workers and therefore highlight the kind of policy recommendations that the group that discussed this has made for the labor market. Next slide, please. Green growth as well. My reading the evidence is that on balance, from a macroeconomic perspective, the best estimates we have that the net labor force effects are quite small. Although our politicians like to accentuate the positive and to stress the kind of great new jobs that are going to be available, the fact is there is going to be a lot of disruption in the fossil fuel markets. And if you simply think through the differences in the technologies required, for instance, and I'll just take one example, to produce electric vehicles, which are estimated to have something like 200 parts versus the traditional combustion automobile, a combustion engine-driven automobile with 1,200 parts. What you can predict is that there is going to be an aggregate need to move production workers out of the production of automobiles, and there's a change in the kind of people who are going to be required. Basically, today's electric vehicles, in addition to their batteries, which are not yet produced in many countries, are basically computers on wheels. And so this is a tremendously skill-biased technical change that is going to characterize this particular dimension of the Green Revolution. But you can go through other technologies as well, and you can see that while they will create a lot of construction jobs initially, which leads to more inclusive growth, at the end of the day, the operators, the designers, and so on are going to strengthen the tendency towards this bias in skill. And we have a lot of people who depend on fossil fuels production. Many of those workers are in far-flung places because that's where we've located the coal mines and other production facilities. The new ones will not necessarily be appropriately located in the same places. And so we face a great challenge in adjusting. And there's a lot of talk about just transitions, and I couldn't underscore their importance more. But nonetheless, thus far, my reading of both what the United States has done in its Inflation Reduction Act and what other countries are doing to think about not just the winners, but the losers, I believe is totally inadequate to the task. And the same kind of division occurs at the global level between those who produce fossil fuels for export, oil exporting countries on the one hand, and the new countries who do have opportunities to specialize in green technologies. Next slide. So I think if we take our lessons from what happened in the past, the failure to deal with the adjustment problems of the globalization that we have experienced ultimately had seismic political effects. And we saw the emergence of populism and an antagonism to free trade, which was ably summarized in the presentation, in the summary of the discussion. Well, we're facing a very similar challenge today when it comes to green technologies. And I don't think there is sufficient emphasis in the discussions on the kinds of policies that are required, both in developing countries and in developed countries, to deal with this dimension of decarbonization. And I would underscore the need for more effective transfer programs, adjustment programs, and training policies, and the emphasis on skills, given the forces that are working on the labor market today. And finally, I would simply underscore that whatever the microeconomic policies are, nothing is better for a well-functioning labor market and for creating opportunities than macroeconomic stability. We've been reminded numerous times and seen the evidence of how worker power and worker rights can be reinforced in economies that are able to sustain full employment. And those at the bottom who are going to experience a lot of the difficulties, the best policies are to drive the economy towards a non-inflationary state of much fuller employment. Let me end there.
Thank you. Some really excellent points. And we had this lecture today by Nandan Nikelani, and I think the idea is that you need policy to adjust for this possible loss of jobs. And one of the features of technological change, when you see the smartphone going, every Indian has one, this is technological change that benefits the poor. And I think this is that even ChatGPT, for example, if it is going to replace labor, yes, but it can also augment. So somebody has coined the term IA instead of AI, intelligence augmentation, if it can be used to conscious policy design to augment productivity. But I think now we will get some more questions, and we can discuss these points. But now I will invite Dr. Homi Kharas, who is Senior Fellow, Center for Sustainable Development, Brookings Institution. He has authored a number of very important reports. He was 26 years at the World Bank, for 7 years as Chief Economist of the World Bank's East Asia and Pacific region, and Director for Poverty Reduction and Economic Management. And among his various reports, I believe he was the lead author for the G20 Committee of Experts, where N.K. Singh was one of the, just discussed in our session. So he's going to talk about multilateralism and geopolitics, and global commons, which is going to be taken up tomorrow. But we look forward to your comments. Homi, for you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ashima. And can you hear me and see the slides? Do you see the slides?
Yeah, we see the slides.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about these, these are very big themes: geopolitics, governance, and the global commons. And I'm actually going to do it in reverse order. I'm going to start with the global commons. I'm going to say a few words about governance, and then about the politics, and then say, what does all this mean for a new multilateralism? Because everybody says that, well, if we've got these issues of the global commons, then that requires multilateral cooperation. Well, what does that really mean in practice? So I wanted to start with the global commons, because it's really the global commons issue that is driving a lot of the change that we see in a lot of the discussion about multilateralism. And the big point about the global commons issue is that it is urgent and it is large. And so I want to start with some numbers, and these are the numbers that you'll see in the expert group report. You'll also see these numbers now in a whole range of other multilateral discussions. But basically what we're saying is that developing countries, and now I'm excluding China from this group in these numbers, because in many ways, when we think about what China needs to do, its reliance on multilaterals is of a different nature, should I say, than many of the other countries. But other developing countries probably, we think, will have to spend something like $5.4 trillion by 2030 every year. These are annual figures. If they're really going to make a serious dent in the SDGs in climate and nature. So how does this 5.4 break down? First of all, let me say it represents an increment of 3 trillion over 2019. So I just want people to be clear about these numbers. That 5.4 is broken down between, let me just call it, other SDGs and climate and nature related investments. And I want to be quite clear in saying that making these kinds of divisions is somewhat artificial, because there is so much overlap between what one calls climate-related investments and what one calls SDG-related investments. Nevertheless, just for clarity, I don't want people to forget how important it is to maintain the investments in other SDGs, and all of these conversations that we've been having about increasing skills, etc., all go to this notion that education, health, skilled labor forces are absolutely essential for these new economies. But the big increase, because we've started from such a low base, is actually in the climate and nature-related investments. And those have to be ramped up very, very rapidly. And you can see from this slide that the big increase there is on the energy transition, but with also important aspects of adaptation, resilience, the loss and damage, and some of the natural capital investments that we've talked about. So this is just to give you a sense of the scale of these kinds of spending. And this is probably something which is around 10% of the developing country GDP by 2030. So it will have big macroeconomic implications if indeed it is implemented. One can go through just to say these aren't numbers that are plucked out of thin air. These are numbers that have actually come from very serious, what I would call engineering approaches, where you look sector by sector and very specific kinds of things. How much will it cost in the power system for zero carbon generation, for storage, in the transport system, for, EVs, in buildings for electrification and energy efficiency and so on and so forth. So it's built from a set of quite detailed estimates of what it would take in order to do these kinds of investments efficiently. I was very struck actually when Kapil was talking and he said that there are short-term upfront costs, but benefits over the long term. I mean, to me, that's just a description of what we mean by investment. Every investment involves a short-term upfront cost and benefits that come later. So in all of these areas, we're really talking about investments. So this is kind of the nature of what we need to do. Then you have to ask yourself the question, how are we actually going to finance all of this? And so if you start from saying this is the investment financing that is needed, some of it will come from domestic resources, some of it will come from external resources. This is the split that we have taken in the MDB report and in other areas. And you'll see that from the external financing side, we're talking about $1 trillion. This is the source of this famous that we need $1 trillion in external financing for developing countries. What do we mean by that? We mean it's going to come from private finance, maybe something around half, some from the multilateral development banks and other sources of non-concessional financing, maybe about 30%, and some from concessional financing from bilateral agencies, which is also going to be quite important. So that's the kind of the breakdown of what we need. But I do want to underline that the notion of the global commons has provided a sense of scale and urgency to the question of development that we have never had before. And so at least in the way I look at it, I kind of now say development was always something that was treated by the rest of the world as something that was quite nice to have. If you can, manage to get some more prosperity amongst more people, that would be a good thing. But if it doesn't happen, I'm sorry, it'll happen sometime later. You can't take that same approach with climate or with nature because of the tipping points that are associated with it. All right. Let me now turn a little bit to governance. And I'm not going to talk about things like, shares in these organizations and their seats and stuff like that. What I'm going to talk about is governance outcomes. Are these organizations, as they're currently constituted, doing the right things? And are they doing them well? So first, I would say, yes, by and large, they are doing the right things. And when there's a survey that was done by ODI, they asked, what are the kinds of things that you think that the MDBs do, which is really relevant, that supports you? And they all say, well, providing external finance at better than market terms, that's very important. Many of them say the knowledge and the technical assistance is very relevant to support their national plans and strategies and budgets. But then they say, how are the MDBs doing? And most of them say it's very complicated and difficult. And in the some of the discussion, I heard somebody, I think it was Ambassador Manjeev, who said that he had tried to write some grants for the Green Climate Fund, and what a complicated process that was. That's a sort of theme that comes out all the time in these kinds of things. So you can summarize this. You can say, look, here are a bunch of things. These blue bars tell you what respondents to this survey say are really important things that they think that MDBs do. And then the orange bar says, are they doing a good job? And you can see that there are big gaps in several major areas. And that's why we can't just say, look, let the MDBs do more. The MDBs also need, in my mind, a different type of governance that pushes them to improve their performance in all of these areas. So one simple area where they can improve is just by being a little bit more transparent and clear about what it is they're doing. If you go into the OECD website and you say, how much private sector money is being mobilized by multilaterals in 2021, you get an answer, $27 billion. When you look at the official report by the MDBs about how much they have mobilized, this is when they report to the Climate Finance Commission, they say it's $63 billion. Well, it can't be both at the same time. I'm sorry. I understand that they use different methodologies in these different places. But when we have a discussion and a dialogue about something which is so important, like private mobilization, it's enormously confusing when important global bodies use radically different definitions and so come up with very different numbers, because it really makes it very hard for us to know what's really going on. There are also lots of things, and some of these we've advanced in the expert group panel report about how MDBs could actually work much better as a system. I think many people know that MDBs actually compete with each other rather than cooperate with each other, and they do that because they're keen to finance a particular project. And right now, there aren't that many projects which are what people call bankable. Why? Because as a public good, development of the project pipeline is a public good. If an MDB develops a project and then another MDB finances it, it's a net loss for that MDB. So they're very careful about which projects are they going to help prepare. It's only the ones that they're going to finance. And we've had, therefore, real underinvestment in this development of the project pipeline. MDBs could do a lot more in terms of cooperating with each other on regulatory and institutional reforms and really pushing that agenda. They even have a database which is called the Global Emerging Markets Database, which is about how their long-term infrastructure projects have performed in developing countries. But by and large, they keep it secret, although my understanding is that now there's an agreement that will make this publicly available. But you need that kind of transparency if you're ever going to have sustainable infrastructure becoming an asset class, which is something we've all discussed, that would make this process much more efficient and which would help private investors have more understanding and clarity when they get into these areas. Now let me just turn quickly to the politics, or if you will, the geopolitics. Where we were at the time of the last World Bank capital increase was the G7 countries were basically saying, we don't want these multilateral development banks to do anything more than what they're currently doing. And in fact, David Malpass, the former president of the World Bank, at that time was Undersecretary of the US Treasury, in his testimony to Congress, he very proudly said, yes, please give the World Bank, this is IBRD and IFC, a little bit more money, and it was quite a small capital increase, because we have got them to agree on a new financial discipline mechanism that will stop them from ever coming back to you again for more money. So it really served to lower what IBRD calls the sustainable lending level, and it generated a limit of $27 billion per year in new commitments. That's now gone up a little bit thanks to implementation of the recommendations of the so-called capital adequacy framework, but still not by much. But the mental frame was, we don't really want or need these institutions to really expand enormously. Then on the other side, you have the developing countries, the big developing country borrowers. And even today, President Lula, when he went to the Paris summit on the new global financing pact, this is what he said. He said, let's be clear, the World Bank leaves much to be desired in terms of what the world wants from the World Bank and the IMF. And I was, smiling. I heard in the last session that maybe the G20 wants to take a look at the IMF as well as at the multilateral development banks. Certainly that's something many developing countries want. But what was the response? The response from the big borrowers was not to say, let's try to fix these institutions. It was to say, let's create our own institutions. And the big new institutions, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the New Development Bank, and CAF in this instance is the what's now called the Latin American Development Bank. These together, which don't have any G7 shareholders, or AIIB does, but were founded by developing countries for developing countries, now are committing something like $20 billion a year. So quite a large portion of the total MDB thing. So my point here is simply to say there is not necessarily a huge amount of political support for the current multilateral development banks. And in the environment, the world environment that we see ourselves today, this is rather unfortunate. And I'm going to conclude with this because as I see it, here are a few propositions which I think many people would agree with. The first is you cannot meet these global challenges without a very sizable step up in public and private investments in developing countries. I don't think that many people would disagree with that statement. Then you say, look, could developing countries just do this by themselves? And again, with very few exceptions, maybe China might be able to do it by itself, but with very few exceptions, because of their limited financial and technical capacity, I would say almost all will need considerable international support. Then you say, where is this going to come from? Some people have talked about new institutions. It takes years for a new institution to actually become operational and to be able to scale up its lending. We don't have years for really starting to address these global challenges at scale. You can't do it just through concessional lending, the Green Climate Fund, etc., because there isn't enough money there. They don't have the leverage. So I believe that we have the only option that we have to deliver this support at scale are the multilateral development banks because of their ability to leverage financial support from their shareholders. But nobody is willing to do that and put more money into these shareholders unless the MDBs in turn transform themselves, and they have to do that before helping countries to transform the world. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Homi. So those are very, very interesting comments. And this issue of competition across in the MDB system, competition as well as cooperation. I was learned recently that the World Bank takes something like 2 to 4 years to sanction a project, while NDB, because they have a lean workforce, they use fintech, and they use local government approvals, do it within 6 months. So, and this financing issue, the geopolitics, if the MDB says you have internal competition, they learn to be more customer friendly, they compete with each other. And if countries can choose where they want to finance, they commit to expand financing to the MDB system, but they give financing depending on comparative performance. Would that be, and then if this money is used more to leverage, bringing in more private sector, because that is where the big money is, if that will be a good direction for the global system to go. But now I think we will take questions from the floor. Please inform who. I think everybody is thinking of dinner. We are at 7:30.
No. Okay. If I could. Well, firstly, thank you for your patience, and I'm glad that the bleed from the previous session helped you get a sense of the issues. So, Homi, both extremely thought-provoking presentations, and I thank you for that. But Homi, can I just ask you, when you talk about the MDB's ability to reform themselves, what are we talking about? Are we talking about shareholders? Are we talking about management? Are they where they are because they have played the shareholders off against each other? Or is it, that these are friendless institutions and so nobody gives a damn? You are talking essentially about the bank. You could even extend that to the fund. So who's accountable, who's culpable, who needs to move, and what's the role of the G20?
So can I respond?
Yes, please. Can you hear him?
So I put this under governance because I think that ultimately it is the governance of the institutions that has to pressure the bureaucracy of the institutions to perform better. And some of the things that Ashima mentioned are things that can and should be done and can be done quite quickly. So you're absolutely right that the time, the processing time for a particular project in IBRD or the African Development Bank is measured in years rather than in months. But it doesn't have to be. And there are actually quite a lot of examples. I spent a good chunk of my career at the World Bank. And for example, we did projects to assist Indonesia after the Aceh tsunami. And there, the timeframes were measured in months. So when the institutions put their mind to it and say, this is a priority and we have to do it, you can do it in months. And there are lots of other examples. Bosnia reconstruction, it was done in months, as you say. NDB does it in months, etc. But there's nothing right now in the system that really forces and pushes this to be the norm for the MDBs. And we have to change that. So whether it is engagement with the private sector, many of them don't have specific targets for mobilization of private money. And they kind of say, this is the way in which we do business. If you want to come along, come along. If you don't, well, that's your business. That's not good enough. We have to innovate on financial instruments. There are lots of examples about how that can be done. So pushing them to transform themselves in a fashion that would make this kind of agenda more doable and more responsive to what countries need, I think is absolutely doable. It'll require leadership. It'll require maybe a change in skill sets in the institutions, but it is something that ought to be part and parcel of the reform agenda of the MDBs.
Thank you. We have some questions from the floor. Santiago.
So thank you, and thank you to the three presenters. I just want to comment a little bit on Homi's presentation, which I thought was really right on the money. I think part of the problem, Homi, is that the way the politics think about the multilateral institutions is completely outdated. They think of multilateral institutions as development assistance in the old traditional way. But what you're sort of talking about is, look, these are agencies of the world to help the world through mitigation in a subset of the world. But they're not doing development assistance in the traditional sense. They're helping the world. These are institutions for the whole world. And maybe what they need is a name change, or they need something for the politic, particularly the politics in the US, to understand that this is not, giving crumbs to those people in the third world, that never get their act together, which is what half of the Congress thinks. What they need to understand is this is a different issue and that they're helping themselves, but the communications of that. And I think here, Suma, the G20 does have some big space in terms of the way in which the message of all these investments are communicated. People need to understand that the beneficiaries of these investments are the guys who live in Kansas and in Florida, and they're benefiting because Indonesia and India are emitting less. And that's what they're doing. And we have a huge communication failure in this dimension. Thank you.
Can I just say, Ashima,
No, I think there's one more question we'll take. You were able to hear this question clearly? You heard this question, right?
Yeah, can I just make one comment about Santiago's point?
Okay.
Which is right. Very quickly. Look, N.K. Singh and Larry Summers did an op-ed on the expert group report. The driving point there is the world is on fire. That ultimately is the point. The world is on fire and something has to be done. We just can't go along saying, well, there might be a risk here or another risk there. Lack of action is right now the major risk for the world.
Right. Canute?
Perfect. Well, thank you for both presentations. Extremely useful, always interesting. Through minor points. One, corroborating what Santiago Levy was saying. Homi, you are right about now, about people like Larry Summers and so on. But the fact of the matter is that 2018, when he was, the former president of the World Bank was Secretary of the Treasury, I was at the board of the World Bank, and that was a negotiation of the last package. And the limits that he established there is with respect to operations of the bank with upper middle income countries. And by the way, he was seconded by the French, by the British, and by the Japanese. The Germans and Scandinavians did not support that because they realized that it's important to operate with upper middle income countries with respect to global public goods. But the point is that underlying the whole thing, Santiago is right in the sense that there is or at least there was until recently, the Alan Meltzer report. It's to shrink this operation of finance to middle-income countries and make only an agency. So things may have changed now that the world feels in fire, but to be seen, but at least until recently it was not the case. Second point was, I cannot disagree with you when you remark sometimes how these institutions compete. It's true. But you presented the case of co-financing of projects as a bad case. I don't know if I agree. No? Okay, I misunderstood you anyway.
No.
Because sometimes...
it's part of what I would say they should be doing to cooperate.
The AIIB piggybacking because it doesn't have the capacity in sanitation projects in Philippines. Okay, so apologize. But in your view, and then I conclude, it's been some time when we had the million from billion to trillions, right? The idea of using the World Bank finance instead of crowding out other kinds of finance, focusing to covering risks so as to maximize the whole bank for the buck. What has not worked? Why it has been a bit disappointing in your view? Unless you think it has worked out so far.
Yeah, please go ahead and answer.
Homi? I think it's very simple. It's that you can't mobilize private money if you don't have public money to put on the table. So simple point, if you want to have a private, let's say solar generation plant, you need a connection to the grid. If you don't have a public investment in public, which is usually public, if you don't have investment in the transmission line, then you've got, 6 months, 9 months, 1 year, wait until you get a connection. Well, that doesn't make any sense. So if you don't move in parallel, in tandem, and start to think about the way in which both the public and the private sector can move together, you're not just going to get, suddenly some private money that comes in. And I think that one of the things now where there's so much more emphasis is it's not just about give a little guarantee here or something else there. You need a very different type of engagement between the multilateral banks and the private sector, what some people call co-creation of opportunities, and a much more hard-nosed allocation of risks for a fee, I might add, not subsidies to the private sector in order to make all of this work.
Thank you. Suman has a question for Robert.
Yeah, Robert, I didn't want the very powerful points you made to be overlooked by the fact you went first. So first, what has led somebody like Asimoglu now to say that, look, we need to, I don't think it's only about AI. He's basically challenging the notion that technological progress is benign. Is that the right interpretation of what he's saying, and why is he saying that? And what are the implications, do you think, if any, for the G20 over the medium term of the trends that you articulate? We've had an important discussion on industrial policy, on the importance of manufacturing and all of that at a national level, and you have what you had to say has implications for that. But is there a G20 role? So 2 questions.
So I really can't speak for him. He's always believed in directed technical change. He wrote some brilliant papers on that subject. So I guess he feels we can direct our technical change in a particular direction. I happen to be quite skeptical. In fact, I'd like to refer to the astute comment that I think Professor Goyal made about AI. So an immediate reaction might be that digital technologies are going to substitute for less skilled labor and therefore hurt developing countries. But actually, there's some really interesting studies. One was done by Caroline Freud with the World Bank, where they looked at hearing aids. And it turns out that the production of hearing aids has a labor-intensive component and a very skill-intensive component. And she found that in developing countries, it is now possible to use 3D printing to replicate the skill-intensive part of the hearing aid. And so she found these developing countries have suddenly started to export the hearing aids. Professor Goyal pointed out AI. AI certainly can be used to substitute for routine labor, but it could also offset certain deficiencies in know-how in emerging markets. So technology, in a sense, will depend on how it is used. Now, there is, and so I don't think we should try to cut off technological development, because I think it works in mysterious ways. And sometimes there are advantages and sometimes there are not. We have to be adaptable and know how to cope with those differences, but nonetheless, it could go either way. The G20, just to come back, I think has to be concerned about trying to come up with some rules, because AI, unlike other technologies, works in especially mysterious ways, because we don't actually understand why we're getting the results we're going to get. And there are huge dangers that it could take over in certain dimensions, and the results could be very damaging. So the current developers are even voicing concerns about this, and I think the G20 should be taking those concerns seriously, although I'm still not optimistic that we're going to be able to stall the quote-unquote progress that it inevitably is going to provide.
Thank you. Hanan had a question.
Thank you. My comment and question relate to the G20 and the MDBs. Okay, I think in the current environment that we are, and the new norm of financial markets and high cost of borrowing for the South, what we need is actually scale up of the role of MDBs, because we need to have actually, access to more concessional financing to be able to continue the development journey. So, and another very important, so one of the things that need to be considered is basically, increasing the capitalization of MDBs, because actually there you can get leverage, which you cannot get by, for example, official development assistance. But also, we need to agree in terms of the need to look into the modality of how these MDBs have been working, the need to take more risk, as previous reports, CAF reports of the G20 showed, but also the need to revise the type of criteria that is used for access to concessional financing. Like, for example, IDA criteria. It cannot be just on income basis. There is a need to update this to include vulnerability, to actually tackle what you're trying to address by these resources. So I think we need a bit of, a review of the operational model, but there is the need for them, I believe, is larger than ever. One more issue is on the issue of the governance. I think one of the things that we also need to ensure is that the voice of the South in terms of the governance, because we need to be forward-looking. And forward-looking, the role of the South will be much bigger than it is now. So basically, to attend to the changing realities of that world, including where the workforce, the majority of the workforce will be, what need to be tackled in terms of the skills and investment now to actually be, a better world and complementary between the South and the North. Thanks.
Thank you. I think that's more of a comment, and we are 20 minutes into our dinner time. So if any of the panelists want to make any specific comment or rejoin, you're welcome. Does anyone want to make a comment? Mari wants to say something. Mari has a question, then maybe the panelists can come.
Sorry, I know I'm eating into your dinner time, but... And I know
I can keep it short, please.
I'll keep it short. I can take offline also the comments. Just one question to Bob, because I really agree with you about the importance of addressing the distribution effects of the technology as well as trade. But I just wondered your recommendations were very general about retraining and so on, and I guess we all know that. But the effectiveness of these policies are really questionable, in the sense that what works and what doesn't work. Did the trade policy adjustment federal program work in the case of the US? I think it didn't work, otherwise you would have had that polarization. So why didn't it work, and how can we make it work better? And I understand Kathy Russ, for instance, works on that. The effects are very local, so you really have to look at the policy's response in a very local way. To Homi, I won't go into, I just wanted to ask two questions on your recommendation about reforms, because it's about streamlining. And as you know, the new president has been talking about how he wants to streamline the process. And it's a big question, but just wondering, two ideas. They can't, the streamlining issue is related to having to fulfill the ESF, and now we have Paris Align on top of that. But the MPA that we did for the vaccines was actually successful in being able to approve a large number of projects and really streamline the ESF and potentially the Paris Align in the future. So some kind of model where you do a few, and then after that, the ones that come after that, as long as they've had followed the template, you don't have to approve them. You just report back to the board. And second, I think allowing loans, especially because we're talking for climate, for regional projects and not country-based projects, I think would be another area where we could have scale. But that also will need reform of the way we do our lending.
Yeah, if the panelists want to respond. Homi,
Sure.
Then Robert. Homi, you want to say something?
Yeah. First, thank you, Mari. Very useful comments and observations. In the G20, you have a large number of the biggest developing countries. If the developing countries themselves don't come and clearly say, we need and want a significant expansion of the multilateral development banks, if they don't say that and put political capital behind it, it will be much harder to push this agenda forward, because the tendency in G7 countries is still to be a little cautious about the claims on their financial resources that will inevitably be entailed. So my plea is, use this occasion where you have the India, Brazil, South Africa kind of sequencing of G20 meetings to build and clearly articulate that position from the major economies of the global South on behalf of all global South. Thank you.
Marie, you raise a very important issue. What works? I think, firstly, one reason, quote unquote, they didn't work before, or they don't seem to have been very successful, is that the scale at which they have been applied, certainly in the United States, has been minimal. And so I think an inadequate, just as the discussion on development has pointed to the inadequate devotion of resources, the same is true in the case of adjustment policies. Nonetheless, they are not a panacea. And I think you also make a very relevant point about the importance of place. And increasingly, people are thinking about place-based policies. But as they talk about place-based policies, for all of you who are quite familiar with development issues, the question is just as focused if you ask what works in place-based policies as were you to have asked the question, what works to encourage economic development? And we all know how complex the answers are to that question. And there's a very analogous complexity in trying to come up with the policies that will work for place-based policies. But I would finally say why I ended on stressing the role of maintaining a fully employed economy is precisely because we're not that good at these microeconomic policies. But there is certainly overwhelming evidence that adjustment is much easier in a fully employed economy, much less costly in a fully employed economy than it is in one where labor markets don't have enough, have too much capacity.
Yes, excellent answer. I think we were just saying that it's very difficult to select what works. So something that works for everyone. And I think we can extrapolate this to G20 also. Because I agree with Homi's comment that the world is on fire. It's literally heating up in a lot of places. So I think for G20 to move forward, you need to identify that common set that everybody wants, everybody agrees to. And I think much of the developed world wants mitigation, much of the EMDs want SDG goals. And what delivers both these is green and sustainable growth, which is what this conference is trying to arrive at and how we can achieve it. So with that, I thank all the panelists. Kapil, you would like to say?
Thanks, Ashima. Thanks, Homi, Robert. This was a bit of a gamble, but it paid off magnificently in bringing together the whole day and adding, the fruits of your research and, of course, your passion and commitment. So with that, those who've stayed till the end are rewarded by dinner. There may be guests who've come and are waiting next door already. Tomorrow morning, we start again at 9:30, but it's only opening remarks, so by me, so you can drift in late if you wish. But the session actually gets going at 9:45. So I will thank all who remain, who have made this such a rich discussion. But Anna, anything else we need to say, or can we just proceed to dinner? Anything more? Okay, well, let's give all of us a round of applause and proceed to dinner.